I had a really cool teacher in junior high school who was young and pretty, and she was new. And the thing I remember about her is that she treated me like a human, like she just treated me like an equal and somebody worthy of, conversing with. And I think I was a teacher's aide in a class, so we had a little different, engagement. And she was from California and same city I'm from, and really loved music and was a Springsteen fan. And she turned me on to him. So it was a very kind of, I don't know, I guess romantic in a way. I'm sure I had a crush on her. I can't quite remember, but
Sure.
just a neat way to be turned on to this amazing music that was full of a message of not only liberation and hope and just integrity and such, but a kind of a compassion and an empathy for certain classes, certain socioeconomic classes. And when I look back, I can see how he gave voice to whatever compassion and empathy I had towards these people, even as most of me resisted and rebelled against it and was kind of repulsed by it. And I think also it amplified that. I was able to connect with more of it earlier on, which is one of the many gifts Bruce's music provided me with.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and joining me today, Troy McFadden. God, why am I doing Todd? Already, I just told you I don't edit podcasts, and now I'm like, oh, I need to edit this podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
Quite well, and no worries about the name thing. I've been called worse.
Well, as someone whose name is spelled with an I all the time, Jessie, I try to get it right. So tell us a little about yourself, Troy.
Well, I work as a corporate coach and an executive
nice.
coach. What else is maybe interesting about me? Well, I'm nomadic. I'm location independent, to sound more professional about it. And I take full advantage of that. So I tend to live at various spots around the globe.
Is that just because of the gig you end up traveling a lot, or?
I do travel some for the gig, but as I said, it just I'm afforded the opportunity to be location independent, and I take full advantage of it.
What's one of the coolest places you lived?
That's a great question, because it's hard to narrow down, because I generally only choose cool places.
Okay, well, just talk about maybe some places you picked and why.
Bali is very charming in many respects. I'm currently in Mexico, in a little town in Mexico that's been voted, I think, one of the top cities, if not the top city in the world or something, by Condé Nast over the last few years. So it has its charms as well.
I don't know if I've ever had anyone calling me from Mexico. I've done South Africa and Australia, a lot of obviously Canada, the US, a lot of different European countries. But I don't know if I've ever had anyone from Mexico, so I can check that off my map.
You can, and I'm sure there are tons of Bruce Springsteen fans down here.
Yeah, that's neat. So where have you always, did your family travel a lot as a kid that got you this bug, or was it different? Where did you grow up?
We traveled a bit, and yet I felt stuck in some of the places that we ended up. And I think that's probably more directly responsible for me getting the travel bug and going with it in my life. I grew up in part in California and then in part in Idaho. And there was such California came first. So Idaho was a very, that came with a big culture shock, and not one that I liked. And that's part of why Bruce's music really resonated with me then, and why I connected with it so much at that age, and why it stayed with me as well.
What kind of music did your family listen to?
My family were my parents were very young when I was born,
Okay.
and I was born in 1967. So I grew up with the music of the 60s and 70s. I grew up with their music, which was atypical for the time, because most of the people I went to school with were the prodigy of 50s generation parents.
Right.
So I was a little bit of an oddball in that respect, in many respects, honestly. And I was always a bit behind the times as far as music was concerned. Like what was cool and popular at the moment, I
Okay.
came to like years later. And until Born in the USA came out, Bruce Springsteen was probably like the most successful mainstream / underground artist that there was, right?
Right.
And a lot of people
Sure.
didn't even know about his music or whatever. And I kind of feel like I lost him a little bit when he got mega popular so quickly. But I digress.
No, no, no. That's an interesting point. The Born in the USA is a gateway album for a lot of fans. And then, of course, some fans tend to now, you know, Born in the USA, you know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and so that's not necessarily something that doesn't resonate with other people. Do So it sounds like you never rebelled against your parents' music. You just loved that music as well as they did, right?
I did. There was a lot of things I didn't love about my situation,
Yeah.
but the music I did, and in particular, my dad was a huge Dylan fan,
Okay.
and so I became one as well. Not because he was one, but I loved Dylan for all the reasons people do, and
Sure.
all the reasons he did, and
Yeah.
then kind of that singer songwriter genre, basically, and I guess a little more broadly, kind of bread and butter roots rock and roll. And so, yeah, and very folky as well. I was always, really drawn to that aspect of music as well.
So you were um, just, as you mentioned yourself, like you were a little off, right? Like if everyone else, you got into grunge, when everyone else has moved on to hip hop, and you're like, hey, wow, as an example, right? Like, hey, this Nirvana people may be pretty good.
That's a great example. And I actually was living in Seattle when grunge first took off, or
Okay.
just as it was, or just after perhaps. And as was the case even in like junior high school, when people were listening to Van Halen and AC/DC, and I was like, that's just a little bit harsh for me,
Yeah.
and then later I came to love them. Well, when grunge first came out, I felt the same way. It's like, oh man, that's just too messy and noisy, and can you tone it down and whatever. And then, at some point I became like, the world's biggest Pearl Jam /
Right.
Eddie Vedder fan. So yeah.
Yeah. There is a subset between Pearl Jam and Eddie Vedder and Springsteen. There is, I
Sure.
think, partly because Eddie is such a big fan of Bruce, and
Mm,
it seems like Bruce is such a big fan of theirs. So there is that kind of combination, which is kind of cool.
super cool.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned a little bit, but when did you first really become a fan of Bruce? And if you can, articulate what about his music spoke to you.
My pleasure. It's kind of a cool story, at least to
Please.
me. I hope it is to the listeners as well. I had a really cool teacher in junior high school, who was young and pretty, and she was new. And so, and the thing I remember about her is that she treated me like a human, like she just treated me like an equal and somebody worthy of conversing with. And I think I was a teacher's aide in a class, so we had a little different engagement. And she was from California, and same city I'm from, and really loved music and was a Springsteen fan. and she turned me on to him. So it was a very kind of, I don't know, I guess romantic in a way. I'm sure I had a crush on her. I can't quite remember, but
Sure.
just a neat way to be turned on to this amazing music that was full of a message of not only liberation and hope and just integrity and such, but a kind of a compassion and an empathy for certain classes, certain socioeconomic classes. And when I look back, I can see how he gave voice to whatever compassion and empathy I had towards these people, even as most of me resisted and rebelled against it and was kind of repulsed by it. And I think also it amplified that. I was able to connect with more of it earlier on, which is one of the many gifts Bruce's music provided me with.
I made a note while you were talking. I've been doing this for about 6 years, and I say that not as bragging, but just I have a fairly good database at this point. And usually, if you're from the Northeast, there's a good chance you found Bruce either through a camp counselor in a summer camp or someone who was going to camp with you. There's a good chance, if you're going to make a bet, that's where you would do. A lot of college roommates, someone on the dorm loved Bruce, but a fair amount of, teachers, where you had they had a teacher that, be male or female, that would have pictures of Bruce on their wall or would work in Bruce lyrics in their stuff, and never as much as Jay did with the Mary question, which we'll get to later. But so that's interesting, because whenever I see a pattern, I kind of like to bring it up so that then you end up looking for the pattern more, right? Like I had not seen the summer camp until someone brought it, and I realized, wait a minute, this is about the 8th or 9th guy that's mentioned that he heard of Bruce at a summer camp in the Northeast. So that's cool. When you kind of discovered him, and because of your teacher, did you go on a deep dive looking for more music? What was the next step in your fandom?
He gave me a mixtape, which I think was all Springsteen on one side of it. So you can tell how long ago this was, right? This is a Maxwell cassette tape. And it was a selection from, I guess, his earliest albums, maybe up through Born to Run. So there were little tasters. So I had a relatively broad overview from the beginning, and for financial reasons and whatever other factors were involved, it was kind of a slow moving into it. I sort of wore that tape out, and then as I was able to access maybe my first full Springsteen album, I bought the one that I thought was going to provide me with the most joy or whatever. I can't quite remember how it all unfolded, but at some point I connected with all of it and still do.
What is your father a Springsteen fan?
I think he likes him, but he wasn't. I don't think he even really knew about him. Wasn't really on his radar until I became a fan. Okay,
because there's obviously the Dylan Springsteen, connection in a lot of ways. That's interesting. So, I always like to preface this, Troy, with the amount of times you've seen Bruce perform live is not a fair barometer of your fan. I have a episode coming out in a couple weeks where I had someone who's lived in, dozens of countries. She's traveled. In fact, she tells this great story about when she was 23, she flew from Canada to Paris and then traveled by land all the way to Cape Town, South Africa.
Wow.
And she's seen Bruce perform once. And I was like, okay, you've been all over the world. How have you not figured out a way to combine, And she's like, it just never just never worked out. So anyway, so there is no judgment here about how many times you've seen him and the correlation between how big of a fan you are, but have you gotten to see him live? And if so, how many times?
What a great story. It makes me feel so much better about the fact that I have only seen him live once.
Okay, that's nice. That's good. Yeah, it was. It was just because usually when I have someone on, that travels extensively, they will talk about, well, oh, you got to see him in Spain, and oh, I was able to take some miles and go to Australia, and catch a legs, and so that's interesting. When did you see him?
I saw him on the Tunnel of Love tour
Okay.
in Portland. So was it Portland? I think it was Seattle. I was
Okay.
living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and then I went up to Seattle. The better story, as it were, is probably the concert I didn't go to.
Please.
Well, I was in high school, huge Springsteen fan, and music was one of my refuges. Very, very important to me, as it is for many, many kids, of course.
Right.
And it was the Born in the USA tour, and he was going to be in Seattle. And I can remember a friend of mine and I worked at a restaurant, and there were a couple of waitresses there that were cute and cool and liked us. And when there's a 2 or 3 year age difference at that point in one's life, it's like, wow, that's so awesome that whatever, a 17-year-old talks to me. And they wanted to go see Springsteen in Seattle. They had tickets, and it was just the dream of like, I don't know, if we're gonna, be on a date with these girls or not, but just the whole romantic idea of like going on a road trip with a bunch of Springsteen fans, being able to see him for the first time, incredible. And my parents pulled the plug on it.
Oh no.
They didn't feel like it was safe, or they didn't understand why, a slightly older girl would be interested and whatever. And it was crushing. It was heartbreaking.
Yes. I have have you had that discussion with your parents since, with love in your heart to,
That would probably be a good thing to do. And it's not like I hold any resentment now.
Yeah.
Part of a much bigger picture. And I had my own very difficult issues with my father, as did Bruce. And that was another way that I could really relate to him. And again, something he provided a voice for. But that particular episode, no, it just was kind of par for the course. But it was a real blow at the time, that's for sure.
I've got I can't remember when this happened. I think it was this year, but Chris was joining me, and he told the story that he's seen Bruce dozens of times, but he said the one that sticks back is that one of his best friends was living in a complex where it was residential and commercial, right? So he had apartments upstairs, and the bottom were commercial, and including a venue where Bruce was going to perform. And so he reached out to his friend, who happened to be named Chris too, and said, like, Chris, you gotta get me tickets. You gotta get us tickets. And like, definitely, I want you to come, but if you only get one, get it for me. All right. And so his friend calls him back a couple of days later and says, I didn't get to do it. I really would have had to sleep with the lady who's managing the building, and I just was worried that's too bad. And he goes, no. So he says, 15 years later, every time he sees his friend Chris, he brings up, if you had just slept with her, I would have seen Bruce. I could have seen Bruce one more time. And I just loved that story, that he is like, he hadn't given up. Like, he's like, go water under the bridge. Nope, he still brings it up. Like,
That's great.
Yes. So a little bit easier with a friendship versus, you don't want to bring that baggage to your parents, especially if you don't have that strong a relationship. Now,
sure.
My son and I had a tough period. My wife and my son had a definitely period that she gets angry if I bring up Independence Day too often. But the reality is, her and my son Chris Independence Day was the story, right? Two people that loved each other that just could not communicate.
Yes.
Um, Now that he's 30, everything's glorious, and we joke a little bit about those rough times, and he will bring up like, oh yeah, but you guys wouldn't let me do this, and we're like, we're sorry, we didn't know, we were doing the best we could,
Sure, of
so
course.
that's great. um so why not other shows? It never worked out.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one because I did travel a lot. There
Yeah.
were surely opportunities I had to see him in foreign locations and even in the States. And I used to
Mhm.
travel a great deal,
Yeah.
being from the American West,
Yes.
traveling great distances for an event when you're young
Yeah.
is kind of par for the course, not unusual at all. And I
Yeah.
did that. I did that for a lot of shows, but for one reason or another, timing or something, it never worked out. And there's a couple when I look back, it's like I really wish I would have seen Pink Floyd live, and I
Yes.
had a couple of opportunities to, and I didn't. And like, why didn't I?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
didn't happen.
I have the same feeling. Like Tom Petty had toured a couple of times here in Dallas, and I just never, because I wasn't a huge Tom Petty fan. It's not like I disliked the music. It was just, and then afterwards, it's like, well, damn, that would have been kind of cool to see. And in fact, one of my best friends had gone to the show when he was in Dallas. I think, might have been one of the last times he was in Dallas before his passing. And I said, Sam, how was the show? He says it was the show that Tom Petty fans would have hated. He said, because I'm a casual fan and he played every song I wanted to hear. And so I figured, if
Yes,
I'm a
yes.
hardcore Petty fan, I'm like, damn it, why is he just doing these hits?
Well, I have seen Tom Petty, I guess is now
Yeah.
the way to put it, several times. So you are
Yeah.
welcome to one of my
Well,
memories.
thank you. I
I'll
appreciate
share.
that. Have you gone to Dylan with your dad?
Not with my father, but I have
Okay.
seen Dylan a few times, not many, at least a
Yeah.
couple times.
Yeah. Sam, by far, Bob is his favorite artist, followed by Bruce. And he went and saw him recently, I guess, in Cincinnati, Ohio. And he said, a great show. He was, in good voice, but he said he played what you would call a hit. The rest of the hour and a half was just nothing. And he says, I can just only imagine the people that were casual fans, like, oh, let's go see Bob Dylan. And you don't get Rolling Stone, you don't get, just nothing, blowing in the wind, nothing. He says, it just, I always think of the story. Linda Ronstadt was on Johnny Carson. And she talked about that as an artist, when she was touring, she would get tired of singing like Blue Bayou or,
Sure.
something. And she goes, and then I went and saw Frank Sinatra, and I had a laundry list of songs I wanted him to play. And she goes, and a light went out, like, oh, when my people come see me, they're the same thing as me. And she goes, so I found a new joy in doing those songs because, the Joe DiMaggio quote, maybe someone is seeing me play baseball for the first time. And so I want them to see the best. So everyone's concert is someone's first concert. So to have that joy.
That's a
Yeah.
cool story. And I think that speaks to the broader concept of, despite all the self-indulgence that can go along with it, you are of service as an artist in that
Yes.
context. And yet, how Dylan is that to just do what he wants at this point, especially,
It is. Yeah. I think Sam calls it the never ending tour, is kind of what fans call it about it. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. That is, he can make the rules. And
Yeah.
so when
he is the rule.
Exactly right. Another story I remember telling is, I grew up loving science fiction and still do, but would pour through Isaac Asimov collections of short stories and his novels. And there was, I guess, when he was going to, he thought, science fiction to pass them by, like when Dangerous Visions, this collection of things. And he says, the fields pass me by. And I think it was Harlan Ellison or someone said, Isaac, when you write, you are the field. And, so I think you could, Bob, when you perform, you are the field, right? It is whatever you do is what you want to do. You
Great
look like you
comparison.
were a big science fiction fan too. It looked like you were nodding your head.
That's right. Yes. In particular, I indulged in Asimov for a several year period of my youth. I just kind of couldn't get enough. I mean, he was brilliant. It was so imaginative and creative, and so we have that in common.
Yeah, I did. I would love his collection of short stories, and he would do the little introduction, whether it is his short stories or collection that he put together. You really did feel like you knew him, and and he was just so smart and sharp. So talk about your day gig. When you say you're a coach, what kind of companies are you working for, and what kind of individuals are you working with?
Well, most of my work comes from my association with a company called the Asian Leadership Institute. It's more of an institute than a company.
Yeah.
And they have contracts with various companies and businesses, et cetera. And so usually I'm sort of paired up with the people that they think I'm a good fit for. I tend to work sometimes with C-suite folks, mostly with middle managers and large corporations. Could be automobile, could be pharmaceutical, retail, people kind of in the trenches, but with a lot of responsibility, in an effort to provide them with more resources, internal and otherwise, better ways to cope, move forward, create balance in their lives, this kind of thing.
What is something that you can almost, going in blind, know that people need help with?
Work-life balance is very, very common. And a close second would be managing their relationships with their colleagues.
Yeah. I've shared that I think one of the toughest things to do is that transition when you get promoted and you're no longer a peer, but you're managing people that used to be your peer.
Yes.
That is really, really hard to find that right balance between, I don't want to be a jerk, but at the same time, I now have a different role and we have a different relationship.
Yeah, that's very common. That's a rough spot for a lot of people, in part because a lot of people are promoted into positions of leadership, not because they've demonstrated good leadership skills, but because they've proven themselves in sales or whatever else. And so it's just kind of part of the process, right? You move up in responsibility and you're given a bit more money and such, but then they find themselves not knowing how to manage or lead, or thinking, worse yet, as it were, thinking that they do based on what has been successful for them in the past. Yeah. And there's a classic line in coaching that, what got you here won't get you there. Yeah. And so suddenly people find themselves stuck or overwhelmed or anxious or whatever. And that's usually when we come in to help support them.
It's a cliche, but I think it's true that some of the most gifted athletes make horrible coaches.
Good example.
Yeah, because just go do it. Okay.
Yeah, right. Just grab the ball, jump 30 feet in the air and just stuff it in this net. Well, yeah, for you.
Yes, exactly. One of my favorite stories is they were interviewing John Elway's mother. And she said that after every, junior high school game, on the way home, John and his father, who is a coach, would go over the game and talk about everything and go over all that. And she goes, and I think that's one of the reasons why John ended up being a very gifted quarterback, because he had that mindset. So then they cut to Troy Aikman's mother. And they go, and she says, yeah, we had a rule that after the game, we could not talk about football. That, we talked about his sister's things or what's going on, but we had a rule that football was football and afterwards was not, that Troy, needed to have a balanced life. And the guy telling the story is, look, if you're going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback, you're going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback no matter what environment you're at because of your gifts. Um, and I do think I'm fascinated this because I have spent the past 30 years managing contact centers, and there's things that I learned the hard way, and I continue to learn because um, when you, especially when you join a new company, you there's a lot of, well, we don't do that here, or no, we've tried that and it didn't work, and you have to have that confidence to go, well, it may not have worked before, we're going to try it again because in the past this has worked, and be open to that. Yeah.
Sure. That's a big part of it, is just being open to new possibilities. Even if some of your approaches work, maybe there's ways to refine
Yeah.
those approaches so they work better, and or open into things that are better still.
So how much has this the pandemic kind of made your life different with all this? Did you do a lot of online coaching beforehand, or did you do a lot of personal, or and then you've kind of reversed with COVID?
I tended to do most of my work online anyway. So in that respect, there wasn't a lot of disruption, although a lot of clients dropped off in that first year because of budget issues and whatever else. And certainly a bit more on a personal note, it curtailed my travel significantly. I was actually in Southeast Asia when COVID hit, days away from coming back to the States on my way to Mexico. Everything was shut down and I was very much ready to leave. And I ended up being there an additional year and a half or 2 years before it was possible. So yeah, it's slowed me down. Tough times for nomads.
Yeah, it is. It is. What do you just listen to your gut about when you want to move?
Yeah, I do ride on intuition often, as far as where I go and how long I stay and all of that. And even as I say this, I realize it sounds very indulgent. The balancing element is that I live in service to others, not just in the context of coaching. I just happen to move around doing that. I am married, and so often, what my wife's desires are, wishes are, whatever, obviously are a factor. But we also allow each other time apart. Right now she's in Thailand because she's living on the beach with some adopted cats and doesn't have to travel for work as she did before, and wants to stay in that bubble. And I think it's beautiful and wonderful, and I miss her, and this is where I'm supposed to be.
That's it. That's a great story. I remember was it James Michener had a novel called Space, which was kind of a reimagination of the space race, where he included real people, but then had an imaginary set. And one of them was one of the guys was his wife went into politics. He stayed, an astronaut, and they never in the same city. They just would always, and they would just find times together. And I remember reading this at 22, 23, like, man, that just, no way that would work. That just doesn't make any sense. And now then at 62, I think one of the things that people ask me, well, hey, you've been married for over 35 years. What, any suggestions? And, I have a couple, but one of them is, you have to have your own space. She has to have space, you have to have space, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with her having time to do what she needs to do, and she needs to be okay with you doing things you need to do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's an aspect of healthy partnership, and that of course can take many forms. It's not always as obvious as being halfway around the world from your spouse for months at a time. I know that like some couples feel like it's a very bold progressive idea to like have their vacations separate from each other. And my wife and I joke that we only get together for vacations. And then we live apart the rest of the time, and that's sort of a recipe for success, at least for us.
That's interesting. So let's talk about some recent Bruce things. What were your thoughts about Letter to You, Western Stars?
A very well crafted album. I love the themes tied in together. I mean, I wouldn't say it's one of my sort of favorite Bruce albums of all time. But
Yeah.
with each album of that nature that he puts out, I'm just touched anew. I find my respect at an all-time high for the craftsman that he is.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think it's interesting that, similar to Dylan, at this stage of his career, to try something new. Western
Mm,
Stars, very different style album than he'd ever done before. And
yes.
then, Letter to You, putting the band back together literally and kind of doing a very quick album. I think it's really impressive. Um, have you got to see the Netflix version of Bruce on Broadway?
I did see it. Yes, I did.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you a little like, man, I should have made that happen?
Well, I don't think it was possible when he was actually there
Okay.
live, but it was obviously a huge success, and he kept adding more dates, et
Yeah.
cetera. And when I first watched it, I remembered, the feelings came up again, that I had when Born in the USA came out. Like, here was kind of a treasure that was sort of, maybe it was selfish or something. This is kind of my special
Yeah.
person. And because he was so honest and so revealing, as per his autobiography, it was like, oh, now he's kind of, the whole world can see,
Yeah.
the real man behind the music. But it's also part of sharing, and I appreciated his openness and, the showmanship and everything that he put into it.
Yeah, I was going into, when they announced they were going to do an autobiography, I was like, well, how good will this be? And you know what? And I
Mm,
was very pleased with how the style and how honest he was about his struggles
yes,
and his challenges. And so I thought it was really, really a beautiful book.
same.
Yeah. So let's talk about favorite albums, favorite songs. What
Mm.
what are songs that, do you go back to that mixtape that you were given by a teacher and like, oh yeah, I got to have those on my playlist, or are there other songs that have changed?
I think that tape is now broken or snapped or wrapped its
Yes.
way around the heads or something, long
Yeah.
ago. Um, I do go back to Badlands, because
Okay.
it was on that tape, and it really, so I guess it was through Born to Run. Obviously, it was Into Darkness as well,
Yeah.
because that's just such a passionate, full on, full throttle,
Yeah.
open throated, open hearted Bruce anthem.
Yeah.
And Jungle Land as well, as far as, impassioned rockers, The Promised Land, all the land, all
Yes.
the all the
Okay.
all the songs with land in the title. And then kind of on the flip side, the sort of yin to the yang, I'll curl up with Nebraska or The Ghost of Tom Joad more often these days, as a way
Hmm.
to just, to get introspective and to, just kind of feel the nuances of it. Because some of those songs, especially on Ghost, are just so insightful and heart wrenching. And it's just, they're just beautiful in that way.
Yeah. I totally agree. Nebraska, is just such a nice change of pace album sometimes to put it on. And especially sometimes the mix of, like when the Seeger Sessions band did a couple of covers, or the band will do a full version. Um, do you ever work in Springsteen references in your work?
I don't know that I have ever, but again, because of his uh, way in the world,
Yeah.
he continues to inspire me, indirectly, I would say.
Yeah. Because I had to, I was, I was traveling to the Philippines for, at the time, the company I worked with had a contact center in the Manila. And so when I got in, the site manager said, hey, we, anytime we have a director or someone come visit us, we'd like you, if you're comfortable, we'd like you to make a presentation, just a 20-30 minute discussion. We'll do it for the day shift. We'll do it for the night shift. We'll do Q&A. Would you be interested? I go, sure, that'd be absolutely fine. And so they asked a bunch of questions, and they did. And so I did a whole talk on better days. That my thought was that, to me, the song is about enjoying the journey and not focusing on, well, when I get the promotion, then I'll be happy. When the kids are out of diapers, then I'll be happy. It's to be happy with the journey. And so it ended up being a really good presentation. And now then I always, whenever you see someone on social media, hey, if you had to do a 10-minute TED Talk, could you do it? And what would you do? And I go, yeah, I do better days.
That's great.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
Well, a few more months in Mexico.
Okay.
Thinking about doing some wilderness guide training next year in the States. I love to hike and backpack, and I want to share that with others and maybe add it to my coaching and vice versa. So that's on the horizon. If the COVID gods are willing.
Have you done part of the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Coast Highway, or?
I have done portions of the Pacific Crest Trail,
Okay,
yes,
yeah.
and spent a lot of time, through the hiking through the national parks and such of the Western U.S. Not so much east of the Rockies. I have to admit to a certain regional bias when it comes to
there's nothing
the
wrong
nature.
with that. I have a nephew that was just searching for himself, and he ended up doing the whole Appalachian Trail. And kind of centered him and helped him. And then later when he did the Pacific, Trail to kind of, so I guess my thought is, I always joke, like every 5 to 7 years, he needs to, I need to go off, just recenter and kind of recharge my batteries to go back to this. And, which is not a bad thing. Not a bad thing at all.
I think the world would be a much better place if everyone did something akin to that every 5 to 7 years, especially if it allows them to get in touch with nature again. We'd take care of the planet better.
Sure. We would. We absolutely would. Yeah. What have I not asked you that I should have, Troy?
I don't know. I feel like this is complete somehow. It's certainly been rewarding and enjoyable.
Well, I'm glad you did that. I always ask that. I tell the story. I had a guy on and we had a good discussion. And then after I hit, stop recording, I said, hey, this will be out in a couple of weeks. And he's, okay. He says, well, next time I'm on, I'll tell you about when I got drunk with the E Street Band. Like, what? What?
Why didn't you lead with that?
Yeah, you
bury the headline.
Yeah, why did you bury the headline? Absolutely, that is great. Well, talk to me. So let's go to the Mary question then. Sure. Jay Armstrong just recently put out a book. The episode, he has bedtime stories for the living. It's all about his journey with his health and his family life. It's a great story. He's been on the song, but he used to be an honors English teacher in the Philadelphia School District. And every year his honors English class would break apart Thunder Road, and they would look at all the imagery. They talk about the lyrics. They would talk about the themes. And then at the end of 2 days, he asked his class, does Mary get in the car? So Troy, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Such a great question, because no answer is wrong.
Exactly.
It would not be unlike a Springsteen song to have a non-Hollywood ending, right?
Yes,
to kind of end on a note of sadness. But I like to think she did, because it was such a romantic, passionate invitation that, what girl wouldn't want to say yes to that, right?
Absolutely.
Someone that loved her and cared for her and wanted to have an adventure with her. And yeah, I'm going to have to say yes, she sure did, joyfully, maybe with some reservations, but with hope and love in her heart.
Very nice. Good. Troy, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I had such a great time. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way? Are you on any social media?
Very little. I think I'm on LinkedIn, and I have a fledgling YouTube channel, but wisdomwarriorcoaching.com is the best way to reach me.
Okay. All right, good. All right. Any final thoughts you want to share?
I just want to share my appreciation for you, for you having me on, for you doing this podcast, so that other Springsteen fans slash geeks slash nerds like us can listen and reappreciate his music and such. So thank you so much.
Well, I just want to return the favor. Thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself and being okay that we kind of went off on tangents as I warned you we might. This was great. This is so wonderful. Safe travels. I can't wait to see what you do next. And if you ever want to join me again and just tell travel stories, I think that would be a blast. I would love to have you do that. Listeners, go get vaccinated. As of today, I am scheduled to get my booster next week. In the meantime, wear your mask, remember to social distance. Let's be kind to each other because that's the only way we're getting through this.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Troy, listeners, thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Doing a podcast at times can be a one-way conversation, and I hate that. So please let me know what you like and don't like about the work I'm doing. You can reach the podcast via email at setlistingbruce@gmail.com. The show is on Twitter at setlistingbruce, and my personal Twitter is at jessejacksondfw. We have a website, www.setlistingbruce.com. From there, you can find links to other Springsteen podcasts as well as other music-themed podcasts. We have a page devoted to our own SLB All-Star Band. These are guests who have been on the podcast more than 3 times. There is a link to our store where you can purchase Set Listing Bruce shirts as well as a Merry Question t-shirt. There is a link to our Patreon page where you can sign up to help support the podcast financially. We have different levels and different rewards based on your support. If you don't have any extra cash, and right now, who does? You can support the podcast by subscribing via your favorite podcast player and leaving us a review. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. And please tell a friend about the podcast, especially if they love Bruce or music, because it will make a difference.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.